Um, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for having me this evening. Well, it's Wednesday evening my time, Thursday midday your time. I'm glad the time zones actually worked out quite nicely in this way. And I really appreciate this opportunity. And my special thanks to Professor Lee for this invitation and all of you for attending and taking part in this. And I really look forward to hearing your questions and conversation toward the end of the presentation this evening. I really wish we could have been together in person in Seoul. You know, perhaps another time, another year, you know, in a post-pandemic world that I know we're all looking forward to. Certainly Korea is a place I would love to visit someday. So whether there or at a meeting elsewhere at a conference, I hope we can make a connection of some sort. So again, it's my great pleasure to be with you here this evening. And if you'll just maybe indulge me for a moment, what I'm going to do first is give you just a quick background, kind of maybe sketch of my background and my priors, just to help you kind of understand where I'm coming from. And it might help to explain some of the things I'll talk about. You know, I should mention that there's a fair bit of self-referential types of things I'll be going through. And so my apologies about that up front, but I hope that in the course of kind of explaining a bit of my own tour through the research field as it relates to news and technology, that you'll see maybe some interesting things that you want to discuss together and ways in which we can kind of think about how to make things better in the future, both in research and in practice. So I was born and raised in a newspaper family, and I began working as a journalist when I was quite young. I later then pursued an MBA and thought I would do something in business journalism, but found that I loved the research part of it. And so I did a PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. Then since 2010, I've been a professor at the University of Minnesota first, and then here at the University of Oregon since 2016. So all of this is to say that even though you know, I have lived in a number of places around the US, and even though I've lived in several countries for periods of time, my background obviously is very Western and very American. And so I look forward to hearing how the ideas that I'm presenting today may look different from a Korean point of view. Now, just to kind of orient you geographically to where I am, so we're in the Pacific Northwest in the US, in the state of Oregon. Here's Eugene on the map. It's a small sort of city of 200,000 people, 2 hours south of Portland. The campus here at the University of Oregon, I'm making the sales pitch here. The campus is really very lovely, very green. We're known for our trees, both in this region and all through the forests and the mountains all around us. Also known for being kind of the sort of the home of Nike, the place where it was originally created, and so that has the kind of the mystique and ethos of Nike is very much connected to the University of Oregon in terms of its track and field emphasis and focus. We're known as Tracktown USA here in Eugene because we often hold major meets and events as they relate to track. Many historic moments have happened. The very historic field we have here on campus has actually now been replaced by this shiny new stadium that will be used to host the 2022 World Championships next summer. We're also known for athletics in terms of American football, certainly. So anybody who knows about Oregon knows about kind of the pageantry around football that we have here. So there's just a few things to kind of get to know kind of where I am and what I've been doing. To set up my talk today, I want to set out maybe a couple of ideas that I think I'll put here at the beginning, and then I'm really going to come to them more fully at the very end. But I want to just sort of preview where we're going here. And what I'll be talking about is this idea that in the study of journalism and technology generally, but I would say especially here in the context of AI nowadays, that normativity is a missing piece. Let me try to explain this very briefly. If we look back at when people were talking about the so-called big data era, which I would kind of put in that region of 2012 to 2016. I was certainly part of doing some of that research. I'm sure some of you were as well, and often that was the term that was used. And if we can talk about how that was maybe a problematic term and not particularly helpful, but regardless, that was kind of the big data moment. And now you don't really hear people using that term. They talk about AI, but in many ways they're talking about similar types of tendencies and tools and techniques. And in the context of news, we're talking about often many conversations about how to improve journalism by harnessing data, automation, algorithms, machine learning, and so forth. So many of the same tools and techniques, many of the same kind of orientations, but talked about in different ways. Regardless, whether we're talking about data from the past or AI in the present, these developments, we can say for sure, yes, have great potential, but also obviously raise a number of big issues and questions. about inequity between data-rich and data-poor organizations, as well as countries, matters of human labor, as well as authority, autonomy. I mean, so many other big questions to address. But I think often missing in some of this discussion is an express interest in normativity. That is, a drive toward evaluating how things should be according to certain standards of good versus bad sort of outcomes. And often normativity has a particular kind of orientation to, at least in the Western context, to kind of democracy and thinking about the public sphere and thinking about how media and information and other infrastructures may be serving people's democratic self-interest and the larger public interest in terms of helping things to be healthy democratically. And so I want to talk just briefly about why this emphasis on normativity I'm trying to put up here kind of at the outset. And I think one is that we can look around the world and see quite a lot of evidence that suggests that we're in a moment of democratic recession in many parts of the world. And I won't go into that in full, but I think we can talk about kind of ways in which that has created just a particular moment that we're all trying to wrestle through as far as what does the future of democracy look like throughout the world. And the second is that simultaneously, journalism, perhaps not coincidentally, because of its connection with democracy, is also under really acute stress from authoritarian actors, from audiences and sort of strangers who increasingly harass journalists in problematic ways, from business models that seem to just be sort of melting before our eyes, particularly for legacy business, legacy news media. And so there's a number of ways in which both journalism and democracy are under a kind of stress that creates then, I think, the conditions for be pushing on questions such as, in the case of AI then, rather than what can AI do for news, how about imagining what AI and related technologies should do in helping journalism fulfill its normative functions in, let's say, facilitating citizenship, helping amplifying democracy, promoting and preserving it, and overall helping people achieve self-determination in the world. Now, we might just more realistically, and I'll talk about later on why I use that term realistically, just narrow this down to saying, what is one thing we should reasonably expect journalists to do for democracy, and by extension, journalistic AI to do for democracy? So again, I want to foreground that idea, that question, and we'll get to that toward the end, but I want to just put that up front as a key part of my talk tonight. So this talk is really in 4 parts. The first 2 are related to one another, and they are kind of a tour of my decade of research trying to make sense of the interplay of the social and the technical in news. And then as part of that, I'll talk about 2 key concepts in my work on humans and machines, one being the 4A's perspective and the other being human-machine communication. And then I'll move toward talking about this question of journalism and AI today. What's getting the most attention and why? And then how is normativity, finally, being missed in some of this conversation? And then what is one thing journalistic AI might realistically do for democracy as we try to bring a normativity element back in? So in the first portion of this year, let's talk about the socio-technical in journalism studies. So let's just say we start with this question, which can seem, on the one hand, very obvious and sort of innocuous. And in a way, we could think of the kind of dictionary answer, which is sort of tautological, which is that journalism is that which is produced by journalists. And I think it's important to recognize that in this question, we have a number of baked-in assumptions over a long period of time. That journalism is presumed to be a distinctly human endeavor. It's generally produced by humans, for humans, for social life and for kind of making sense of the public sphere as it relates to human beings. And these are mostly taken for granted notions of journalism, particularly as it has become a professionalized practice over the past 100 years. But I think things start to get a little more complicated as we look a little bit closer at each of the elements in this question. So first, it depends on how we define journalism. Now, broadly speaking, it can refer to the making and circulating of information that people recognize as news. It's the kind of systematic process of gathering and delivering that sort of information that we call and recognize as news. But we also recognize that journalism is a kind of institution. It's a social category. It's a kind of container, but it's a sort of leaky container, right? I think increasingly it's a profession, yes, but one with fuzzier dimensions than ever before. It's a communicative practice, of course, but one that many people can seemingly become part of and engage with. And then it complicates then what counts as news and who counts as a journalist. which is not inconsequential because in many parts of the world, in many countries, definitions of that sort then have real ramifications in terms of legal consequences, financial resources, and other types of access to government and so forth. So just as a side note on this, recently I was asked to write an encyclopedia chapter that was to be the chapter for the handbook, or excuse me, the Encyclopedia of Journalism Studies. And the chapter I was asked to write was titled Journalism. And I thought, okay, sure, that sounds fun. And then I realized it was actually a really kind of challenging task because I was trying to get my hands around journalism in a 1,000-page book that was dedicated to the topic. And so it just really reinforced me the difficulty of this term, this concept. So for me, this brings up a number of questions about boundary work, or the symbolic contests in which different actors fight for definitional control to apply or remove certain labels, or otherwise establish jurisdiction or control over a particular social domain. So this is obviously not exclusive just to journalism, but this notion of boundary work, which comes from the sociology of science, is one that Matt Carlson and I used to try to elaborate on the boundaries of journalism in our 2015 edited book. You know, taking up questions such as what counts as journalism, who qualifies as a journalist. And our purpose was not so much to provide ready answers to those questions, but rather to kind of explore how those questions themselves become really useful entry points for interrogating and understanding the conditions around which status, authority, and so forth are granted, you know, based on how certain conditions play out. So even if we come to then some degree of kind of settled definition on journalism, just figuring out the who in this question, I think, again, raises the complexity of it. Because, of course, journalists do journalism, but nowadays they are often working alongside and sometimes sharing the space with a growing array of social actors, of people who come from, you know, different specialties, different backgrounds, be they data scientists, be they computer programmers, you know, different types of folks who are increasingly participating in the process of making news, producing news, and publishing it in digital forms. And of course, this is not to mention the many, many non-journalists, the many, many people out there who have smartphones and who contribute eyewitness material and who participate in what has been called random acts of journalism by being at the right place at the right time and then sharing it on platforms. So obviously the who gets a little bit complicated as well. Just to show you some of the things that I've been working on in this area, about a decade ago, I became quite interested in understanding the hacks and hackers phenomenon. This might be something you're familiar with, where what we saw was that this kind of growing interplay and intersection between the journalism community, or the hacks, as it were, and the hackers representing, and I should say hackers in kind of the good sense of the term, of people who code because they try to build and make things better, as opposed to people who are trying to steal and tear down. This kind of interplay of journalists and programmers was one that began to catch our attention as I worked with Nikki Usher on these sorts of articles about this kind of coming together, which, as we looked at, was, you know, both a kind of an arrangement that involved communities, such as hackers, actual meetings and organizing and a community of practice coming together, but also a kind of meshing of different cultural frameworks and orientations. So the open source community with its own sets of values and norms, and the journalistic community with its own ideas about what transparency might mean, or what it might mean to iterate or tinker and to play with things. So that was a way of trying to understand the who in this conversation. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about how some of the things we assumed about programmers coming into the world of journalism may have actually been a little bit overblown. And in fact, it was more about journalists beginning to adopt some of the tools and sensibilities and techniques from programming communities. So another way to kind of understand the who here, and this is another kind of element that I've been studying over the past several years, is how different concepts from sociology can help us to sort of look at these communities in new ways. I love the concept of art worlds that comes from Howard Becker. And this concept reveals what he describes as the cooperative networks of people and processes or practices that allow art to become recognized and appreciated as art. It's because of the shared forms of meaning making that happen within a given art world. So he's drawing on ideas of symbolic interactionism here to develop a way of understanding how sort of shared meanings, shared orientations, and conventions around certain practices allow art to become recognized as such. So let me just give you a couple of examples. Often when we think about like an orchestra or symphony, and I'm sure many of us would like to attend such a thing nowadays, and we miss the time when we could attend a lot of art in person like that. But when we imagine those things, we think about the violinist or the cellist or the oboe player. We think about these people as the artists. But what Art Worlds as a concept does is help to recognize how these people, while certainly artistic and creative, the work they do is rendered because of a whole network of actors who bring it about, whether it's from the violin maker or the person marketing the performance or any number of people who are involved in helping to kind of make art come to be recognized and appreciated as such. So this approach shows how art it's a networked achievement, but it's one that also confers upon certain types of actors a kind of status. So some people are perceived as artists or creatives, and others may be perceived as support personnel or technicians. Again, in the example I just described, we recognize the players in the orchestra as being artists. We don't as readily recognize a lot of the support labor and technical labor that goes on around them, but is certainly essential to bringing about that art. Now, the reason I particularly like this concept is that it includes some ideas about notions of collective activity, of conventions, of status conferral, that I believe can be applied to understanding how certain worlds of journalism, much like worlds of art, may emerge or disappear over time, how technology may play a role in changing the conditions for new types of actors, routines, and modes of work to emerge or to kind of wane. And so in this particular chapter that Rodrigo Zameth and I wrote for the book Remaking the News, we examined a number of kind of spheres of work that are not exclusive to any particular organization, but that cut across the journalistic occupation or profession as a whole and are becoming their own kinds of worlds of activity. And so we pointed out how data journalism, algorithmic journalism, and ambient journalism may be reflective of these sorts of practices. That is, they have three things that are important. They have a collective orientation about broader goals. They have shared understandings of proper work conventions. And then they have forms of symbolic capital that are given to the high status artists in those communities. And I think some of these same tendencies and sort of orientations are also evident in like Nikki Usher's book about hackers, data, and code. And then a lot of great work that is being produced about data journalism as its own kind of community of practice, as its own kind of genre. So the point here is to say that when we look at what's happening within journalism, when we look at the who, the social element, I think we can find lots of interesting ways that it is changing in ways that kind of call up interesting questions sociologically about how do we understand these networks, how do we understand how they engage with one another, on what terms, around what sort of modes of meaning making, and how does, as a result, certain types of people and practices become prioritized relative to others. How does that change over time and with what sort of implications? Another way of thinking about this is that one example from Howard Becker's work is that over time, notions of creative and technical or artistic and support can actually change. So something that may previously have been seen as purely technical or support labor can actually become seen as creative or artistic in its own right. And a new world may develop around that, or the person's role and activity may become seen differently over time within a given art world. An example that he uses is of sound mixing and recording engineering, and how 50 years ago, that type of work was seen as purely technical. But then over time, because of sort of new technologies that emerged and different ways of manipulating audio, and I think as we look at kind of just the way in which DJs have become recognized as true artists in their own right over the last several decades, that I think speaks to ways in which this previously technical activity came to be much more creative in nature. And I think one facet of studying newsrooms over the past decade is how, people who, when I was working in a newsroom 15, 20 years ago, people whose work was primarily technical in nature, over time has become increasingly creative and central to the process of producing the thing that is recognized as being the kind of preeminent product or the art that is produced in the course of journalism. And that, I think, is an interesting change. I think speaks to some opportunities for us to kind of look at how concepts from sociology can be applied into journalism, and in turn, how journalism can help to explain social processes. All right, so we've talked about journalism, we've talked about who, and then even if we get comfortable with those two, then we take up this question of what does journalism, right? So as I mentioned, of course, journalism is primarily a human endeavor, but technology has always been entwined in it in some form or another. What is, even automation has been in the newsroom for several decades, longer than many people have realized. But there's no question, of course, that nowadays we have modes of algorithms, automation, and even AI that are changing a number of practices when it comes to the way that information is gathered, filtered, and distributed in ways that normally we associate with humans. So we definitely need to kind of think about moving beyond purely anthropocentric ideas that only humans are the ones who make and circulate news. And we're beginning to recognize and try to untangle and unpack what it means when we have machines more fully involved in that process. I think what I call a classic example, because in some ways it feels like an old example, but it's still a very useful one, is the case of automated journalism. So it's now, we're talking 6 or 7 or 8 years going now, that forms of automation have been used to take structured data, like the kind you can see here on the slide, and render it into narrative story text with little or no human intervention in the process. Now, of course, humans are heavily involved in creating these story algorithms, but once the templates are established, then in many ways, it's just a matter of deciding what, just feeding it the data, and then these narratives, these stories can be produced. As you can see from this quote here, in the case of financial reports, software transforms earnings data into a publishable Associated Press story in a matter of seconds. As a result, AP now produces 4,400 quarterly earnings stories, an almost 15-fold increase over its efforts when it was done purely by humans. So as I said, this is kind of the classic example. We can look at lots of different ways in which this template-driven approach, which even though it allows for lots of variation, as you can see in this example here, the software wordsmith allows for variations through synonyms, various branching techniques, various kinds of ways you can bring all kinds of different types of writing to a particular template. Nevertheless, it is still a very template sort of automation mode. And we'll talk a little bit later about AI and how it is a little bit different. At least it expands the frontier of possibility. But I would say what I find fascinating is that even though we've now had this example with us now for 5, 6, 7 years going, still, when you look at a lot of trade press coverage of automated journalism, we still get images such as this, right? Which I find fascinating because I think the images reveal so much about how we're trying to make sense of what's going on as machines take on roles normally associated with humans. So we get these kinds of pictures, which are curious, right? Because not only are the machines now involved, but there's almost kind of like this move back in time to typewriters and to cigars and fedoras. And so we have the smoking habit, which fortunately has been lost by the time we get to this robot, now typing on a keyboard instead of a typewriter. But I think these images themselves are revealing for what they suggest about how we as humans are trying to make sense of where these kind of machine collaborators fit into the social context that is the newsroom, that is the space of making news. It's a little bit, I think, like what happened about 100 years ago, when the telephone was still becoming a kind of fully realized part of everyday life. There were accounts of journalists actually acknowledging at the end of stories that the story had been reported with the help of the telephone, right? That some of the interviews and data had been gathered that way. And of course, now we would laugh at that idea, but nowadays we have disclaimers at the bottom of stories saying that this story was produced with an algorithm. And I think it certainly makes good sense to offer that transparency, but I wonder if it's partly just we're not quite sure how to acknowledge and account for the involvement of technology into the process. So we can go back to this question briefly, and then we'll kind of move on here and looking at some examples in some concepts as they relate to the socio-technical. But I think what's important to see here is that this is, yes, increasingly complicated, but obviously really interesting. I have found it interesting, at least over the last decade, to study this interplay of humans or social actors and non-humans or technological actants, all engaged in a business and a practice that is transforming in a whole host of ways, including ones that have growing normative importance, as we'll talk about later. So as I mentioned, I'd like to focus on two concepts that are core to my work, one being the 4A's perspective and the other human-machine communication. And the first of these comes from a question that Oscar Westland, he's the editor now of Digital Journalism, and he and I began working together around 2013, and we started kicking around this question of, can we develop a heuristic to better represent the changing nature of people, things, and processes that make up digital media work, particularly at the organizational level of analysis. And this is something we had been thinking about because Oscar in his own research had been intrigued by the fact that business people, marketers, even though they worked in news organizations, were rarely ever reflected in the studies that people did of journalists. And there was often kind of this sort of, a lot was left out of the picture. When looking at how media work was accomplished within an organizational setting, we tended to look at journalists in isolation from the much larger set of processes. And so we began to investigate this. And what we developed was what we called the 4A's of cross-media news work. One that recognizing the role of social actors, that is humans in news production, especially journalists, of course, but also technologists and business people. And these people, again, working internal to the organization. The other technological actants, and this may sound familiar if you're familiar with actor network theory. One of the things that we did in this piece that we wrote in 2015, laying out this concept or this theory, is that we tried to differentiate the approach we're taking from actor network theory, because I think one of the key differences is whereas actor network theory doesn't really draw a sort of a priori distinction between actors and actants, between humans and machines, we do draw that ontological distinction and then talk about how and why that's important. And I won't go into all the details here now, but I just simply want to acknowledge that at the outset. So the actants, of course, refers to the various types of non-humans enrolled in news production, from apps and algorithms to content management systems, APIs, and so forth. And then all of these have, in their approach and their orientation, they may have encountered different types and configurations of audiences, which may vary by distribution platform as well as the relative articulation. So for example, do producers see audiences as passive or active? And how does that change the way they interface with audiences as a result? And then finally, we can look at kind of activities as representing all the work practice endeavors that go on from large to small, all the ways in which actors, actants, and audiences might come together. So this is just a basic illustration of kind of thinking about how these things fit with one another. You have this kind of triangle between actors, actants, and audiences, and then the activities that range from daily routines of production on up to strategic innovation, and the way that brings these different types of players into contact with one another. And the point with this model is simply to say, to really understand media and the way it's produced, the way that media work occurs in an organizational setting, requires, in our mind, taking more fully into account the various types of entities that fall under each of these categories. And to think not just of the ones that are internal to the organization, but for example, the way that the social actors engage with non-human actants from outside the organization. And to think again about the ways in which audiences may be conceptualized differently, and then depending on those conceptualizations, how that might yield different types of results. So just a little example of how this might fit with automated journalism. So how it like calls up different types of questions. We might ask, how do different social actors, for example, journalists in comparison to technologists, in comparison to business people, how do they shape the norms, values, and ethics encoded into actants such as story algorithms? How are actants differently programmed, whether internally within the newsroom or externally by third-party providers, as it occurs in many cases? How are audiences conceptualized by algorithms, by machines, and who encodes them as such? And then to what extent can these actants learn on their own, which is what the essence of AI, and with what consequences? One article that I did recently was to collaborate with some media law scholars to evaluate the extent to which news media may be liable, particularly in the US or in other countries, may be liable to the extent that their algorithms actually produce libel or slander of some sort. And so to the extent that, if libel by bot occurs, who becomes liable to pay damages in those situations? And so that was, I think it's an area of interest of mine, because I think increasingly that type of question is not given the sort of due consideration it needs. Now, the other concept that I've been sort of focusing on in recent years is kind of saying, wait a second here. Does the introduction of automated, algorithmic, augmented forms of communication actually complicate some of our very basic assumptions about what is communication and how it should be analyzed in a world of humans communicating not just through machines, but with machines? And for that, I've been working with Andrea Guzman, who's just been a wonderful collaborator and who has really been at the forefront of developing this concept called human-machine communication. And I would definitely recommend the book that she has edited recently on this subject. The way to think about this is HMC is both a concept and an emergent field. So as a concept, it orients us to the creation of meaning among humans and machines, just as we think about the creation of meaning among humans when it comes to the way they communicate with one another. And as a field, it focuses on the study of the creation of meaning among people and machines and the aspects thereof, inclusive of the different philosophical, theoretical, and methodological approaches. And I emphasize that because essentially that is what HMC is trying to offer, a fairly big tent perspective that allows, kind of quantitative and qualitative, that allows humanistic and critical approaches to sit alongside more social psychological ones, but to sort of recognize the broad array of processes by which communication scholars can understand this notion of meaning and how it's created, not just at the intersection of human and human, but also human and machine. So just a couple of clarifying points, because I think these are some questions that often come up. Obviously, this does not ignore the real and obvious ontological differences between humans and machines, nor does it assume that human-machine communication is the same thing as human-human engagement. Clearly, it's not, and it's certainly not yet and may never be. And it's also not about competing with human-computer interaction, human-robot interaction, or other fields. It's not about sort of contradicting them in any way. Rather, it's a more kind of umbrella approach that it attempts to encompass the many approaches to understanding the distinctly communicative aspects of the human-machine encounter. And I would kind of linger on that word communicative, because I think one way to think about this is that it's, in a sense, a kind of homegrown theory within or concept within communication as a discipline that puts emphasis on communication at the forefront. So for example, whereas HCI and some other approaches may be more oriented to information exchange that may have elements that are certainly relevant to communication, but may also speak to issues beyond communication. I think this type of HMC approach is oriented to a kind of like meaning making and sort of issues of culture that may be not quite as easily captured by some approaches from computer science, let's say, but are relevant for understanding the communication process. It also challenges the kind of anthropocentric paradigm of a lot of communication research as developed in the West. So these sort of assumptions here being that humans are natural, alive, feeling, and yes, communicative, and machines are artificial, lifeless, neutral, and non-communicative. So it pushes back against that paradigm to instead say, how might we think differently and approach questions in a new way if we allow for machines to be situated in a communicative role? Just as an illustration of this here, if we look at how the communication discipline, as it has developed in the US, and look at the way it assumes a human-to-human model that is derived from a kind of two-part emphasis here. So this illustration is from the website of the National Communication Association. And notice how obviously not all communication is transactional in this nature, but it does kind of assume a sort of dyadic person-to-person exchange of messages that might use technology to convey those messages, but that's not really that important, right? What's important is that it's person to person. And we see this embedded, whether in the study of interpersonal communication, such as communication studies, or the way that we look at media industries or mass communication. In both of those, it does assume at bottom a kind of human-to-human model of engagement. And so human-machine communication is a way of kind of asking, like, conceptually, how do we account for machines that talk back, that are situated as conversant agents, ones with whom people might actually build dialogical relationships. So as an example, Andrea, my co-author on this, her dissertation several years ago was to explore the types of relationships people built with, engaged with Siri. So over time, as they used Siri and other sorts of voice agents extensively, how did they come to see and imagine them and sort of engage with them and begin to kind of give them sort of human flavor, as it were, and what sort of relationship from a communicative standpoint emerged in that. And I think that looking at AI and the frontiers that we'll talk about in just a second, what we describe in these pieces here that Andrea and I did is to try to look at, well, what is communicative AI? What does it mean then to take human-machine communication as a concept and position the machine as a communicator? So in other words, for example, how do people understand a technology as a message source? Or if we think of the machine as social entity, how does technology become part of the social elements of newsrooms and newsmaking? I think, for example, of the ways in which news is not really made without a lot of talking. Journalists talking, reporters talking with editors, editors talking with higher up editors. There's often a lot of conversation, chats, in-person conversation, whatever it may be. And so what sort of voice does a machine have in that process? Or what sort of human voice may be missing because of the inclusion of a machine, right? So essentially the idea is that having the machine in a communicative role complicates and at least forces us to think harder about the social context of communication, of newsmaking in that regard. All right, so this brings us now to thinking about communicative AI, but in the context of journalism. And just to kind of try to set the record straight from the outset here, I think a lot of times many things come to mind when we talk about AI, and it can lead to lots of confusion. So I find it helpful just to split this into two forms, to think about narrow AI on the one hand and general AI on the other hand. Narrow AI would be what we might call real AI. It's AI as it actually exists today. It's AI that's designed to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, but they're rather specific and narrow, and whether that's in playing a certain computer game much more effectively than a human, or whether it's learning how to tag and sort of recognize images and learn from a large corpus of data much quicker than a human could, that's a kind of more narrow AI approach, right? Narrow in scope, clear in purpose, has human-like intelligence, but does not attempt to act in a fully human sort of way. Whereas general AI is what we'd call imagined AI. It's sort of the Hollywood version of AI. It's the AI that we worry about destroying us because it's smarter than us, right? It's a kind of general problem-solving ability that is simply not evident in computers and may never be. But it's certainly that, I think, helps just like bracket those two things off. One that's really in the realm of science fiction, and one that is actually in the realm of what's happening in the day-to-day right now in terms of AI technologies. I like this definition that comes from Felix Simon at the Oxford Internet Institute. He and I have been working together recently, and he says, AI is the activity of computationally simulating human activities and skills in narrowly defined domains, most commonly through the application of machine learning approaches, a subfield of AI in which machines learn from data or their own performance. All right, so you can kind of break that apart a bit and say, okay, so it's computationally simulating human activities and skills, okay, in narrowly defined domains, like I just said. And it's most commonly today, when we think about how it's used in media and communication, it's through the application of machine learning, right? So often that implies simply giving the machine a task and then providing it data and resources and sort of nudges that help it to begin to learn more effectively and yield a better result time after time in a kind of iterative approach. But it really is just a subfield of AI. It's like, it's not really representative of all of AI. And I think Meredith Broussard, in her book, Artificial Unintelligence, explains this quite well. So machine learning, very relevant for what we're talking about today, but it really is just a small part of the overall exploration going on today as it relates to AI. Now, not all automation is AI. I mean, dishwashers and washing machines are automated, but they are not AI. They are not programming themselves or not really changing the way they do things generally. But all AI obviously is a form of automation that's intended to learn from experience, to act with some degree of autonomy and some degree of adaptability. So journalistic AI, we could say, is the use of AI tools to accomplish journalistic tasks and processes normally associated with human intelligence. Now, I'd like to point you to these resources. I think I can only give things a cursory glance today, but I would highly recommend these books and resources because Melanie Mitchell's book really goes into AI in a much more, in a much deeper way. And then if you want to look at applications to journalism, this report from Charlie Beckett at the LSE and the book Newsmakers by Francesco Marconi go into much greater detail about what we're actually seeing in the context of journalism. I'll give you just a few examples by illustration here. So these are some examples of AI in journalism. We have the Wall Street Journal that has a dynamic paywall. That is, it uses a machine learning tool to be able to assess how likely it is that a given user who lands at WSJ.com, how likely they are to subscribe. And then depending on different factors and the likelihood of subscribing, the site will then offer different levels of access in terms of how much they'll let the person read for free. ByteDance, this Chinese mobile app, they use an AI-powered personalization engine to source and curate daily news for thousands of news sites every day in a really pretty astonishing way. There are companies like DeepL that build deep learning tools to decipher and automatically translate text. Now, I'm not going to go into it today, but machine learning, deep learning, they're related to one another. They're a little bit different, but they're involved just, again, this similar process of trying to allow the machine over time to learn by just working on lots and lots of text, lots and lots of data, and over time getting better and better at its results. The New York Times has this Project Feels, where it tries to understand and predict the emotional impact of its news stories, and then present personalized ads accordingly. Sounds a little creepy, but I think we can see ways in which that is trying to more effectively monetize journalism, which I suppose we can find lots of ways to appreciate that. And then finally, YLE in Finland has a kind of AI product that ensures you don't miss the news you want to read by giving you smart news recommendations using notifications on your lock screen. So again, trying not to just blast news the same way, but instead trying to give people personalized notifications and recommendations based on what it can learn from previous habits. So what I think a few things become clear as we look at these things, that I think we can see that AI in journalism is primarily about human-machine collaboration. And this is true for other knowledge work as well. The things that I'm talking about here related to news can certainly apply, I think, to higher education and lots of other realms as well. We're talking about augmenting rather than fully automating or replacing journalism. That's a key thing that many of these authors will talk about, is that it's not about replacing, it's not about putting journalists out of work as much as it is augmenting. Now, does it have consequences for journalistic labor? I certainly think so, and I certainly think it will in the future. But at the moment, we're talking primarily about creating efficiencies, about gathering data, categorizing data, spotting trends, tracking sentiment among the public, automatically transcribing interviews, and perhaps surfacing key quotes. I mean, these are the kinds of things that the efficiencies that journalists are looking for, and that can help to free up their time for investigative, deep dive, really original type of work that only humans can do. Now, much of the hope and the hype surrounding journalistic AI often rests on the promise of making journalism both better commercially and better editorially. And I would say that's certainly a laudable goal, but there are ways in which I think we need to be concerned about whether that's actually possible, and also ways in which, to finish out here, I would like to talk about how I think that's missing still a key piece of normativity in this puzzle. Now, what do we mean by this? I like this quote from Jay Blumler and Stephen Cushion, who say that the broad church of public communication, this is from 2014, the broad church of public communication, which includes the contributions of journalism and journalism studies, is an inescapably normative domain. That is, it is inescapably involved in the realization of, or failure to realize, collectively self-determining processes of citizenship and democracy. Civic values, they say, not only utilitarian ones, not only financial ones, not only professional ones, are at stake in how journalistic institutions perform. So I'm struck by how they talk about this notion that the normativity element is inescapable. We cannot talk about journalism without reckoning with its role, either in succeeding or failing, either in realizing or failing to realize collectively self-determining processes of citizenship and democracy. Now, there is a much longer and bigger debate about whether journalism and democracy are truly one and the same, whether they're connected, whether how close they really sit next to each other. And I won't be able to get into all of that tonight, but I think at bottom, we can say that a lot of journalistic kind of norms and values and orientations are built on this basic assumption that journalism is inescapably connected to fulfilling some degree of self-determination for people when it comes to being more effective and productive and healthy and happy citizens, and collectively at the democratic level as well. And as I mentioned before, there are many reasons for us to be concerned about the state of affairs in democracy today. Just to cite what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago today, we had the storming of the Capitol by a pro-Trump mob, and that certainly marked a very low moment in the history of U.S. democracy, given that it was related to some false claims about electoral fraud. But I think it also spoke to potentially some failures on the part of journalists to really, perhaps I think it became a moment of reckoning, and it still is a moment of reckoning for us to think about what role do journalists have, and the sort of broader media ecosystem, platforms and others that provide key information. What role and responsibility do people have in trying to put a kind of pro-democracy frame at the forefront? And I think, so it's useful to think about what happened 2 weeks ago, what happened today with the inauguration of President Biden on the very same setting of what happened 2 weeks ago at the Capitol. And it's just, I think, a very just particular moment for the US, but also I think for many people around the world to reckon with what is journalism's role as it sits in relation to democracy. Michael Schudson has famously talked about 6 or 7 things that journalism can do for democracy. And these are going to sound very familiar to you, I'm sure. Inform the public of what public authorities and other figures are up to, serve in an investigative or watchdog function, offer analysis. Number 4 is interesting. We don't often talk about this one, but encourage social empathy, provide a public forum for debate, serve as an advocate for various policies and points of view, argue in favor of democracy. Like I said, kind of taking a pro-democracy frame. As he points out, this 7th is often usually ignored. But by another perspective, and this comes from Rasmus Cleese-Nielsen from a really good 2017 article that I quite liked, he notes that really maybe there's just one thing that journalism might do for democracy. And one of his key arguments is that many of the people who talk about democracy in the ideal sense, often they do it from a counterfactual way. There's no way to really demonstrate that one particular democracy at a certain point of time was the perfect ideal, that it lived up to all of its ideals. And so it's counterfactual, and it's not then particularly helpful. It's almost just sort of pie in the sky, unrealistic. But he also argues that Schudson's 6 or 7 things, while wonderful in theory, are a bit too liberally optimistic. And it may simply be out of range for journalists to actually feasibly accomplish those things, particularly in light of all the pressures that journalists have faced over the last decade. Pressures that were not as apparent in 2008 when Schudson described those 6 or 7 things journalists might do. So instead, he offers what he calls a democratic realist approach. And he says it's based on what actually existing journalism could conceivably do for democracy. It's rooted in something journalists actually want to do, which helps. And it identifies something that is distinct to journalism specifically. So he says, I identify one thing journalism might do for democracy that is distinct, that journalists want to do, and that actually already kind of exists and is conceivably accomplished, doable. And that is, he says, to provide people with relatively accurate, accessible, diverse, relevant, and timely, independently produced information about public affairs. So I've been inspired by this idea and have thought, we need more to take this notion of this one thing, a democratically realistic approach, and how might this help us then develop a kind of way of thinking about AI that could be more productive than what we have so far. So Bibo Lin, who is a PhD student here in our program at the University of Oregon, he and I are working on this project to try to envision what is one thing that journalistic AI might do for journalism's development, and by extension, its contribution to democracy. And we have a few things to suggest. I'd certainly welcome hearing from the rest of you as well on this, because it's very much a process that we're going through, and we're still in progress on this. But one thing that we believe that a normative approach of this sort, a one-thing normative approach, might offer to developing journalistic AI and by extension improving journalism, is that this kind of way really gives us a set of standards that are widely accepted, and they're more readily measurable than most. We actually then could probably turn these into something that can be measured and used to evaluate whether things are working or not. This one-thing normative approach can be a useful heuristic for checking if technology development is actually serving journalism's most essential functions. So let's consider those together. The first being accuracy. So accuracy, of course, there's still many, many mistakes that occur in journalism. This remains a persistent problem. To what extent can AI help? And if it can, then accuracy ought to be one of the things we prioritize, because it is one of these clear and essential functions of the kind of one thing journalism can do. Accessibility is the next thing that Rasmus Nielsen talks about. And here we may be thinking about like ways in which news can become more readable, more explainable, more understandable. And I would say that, right now we have AI that can produce more text, that can make more news. But what can it do to actually make news that is more accessible to more people? That would be a greater achievement than what we have right now. Diversity is the next item. So here we might ask, what could AI do to surface more diverse viewpoints across divisions, particularly at a time of great political division in this country, but also in many other countries as well? So how could AI serve that means of accomplishing this question of diversity, which is so crucial, not just in politics, but in many aspects of culture and society today? And we don't see at present as much kind of AI development pushing on that particular issue of diversity. Fourthly, we have relevance. And of course, relevance can take on different meanings, but one way to think about it is, how can news be made more meaningful, relatable, and valuable to people? I've been doing a number of interviews with news consumers over the past year, trying to explore what is valuable about news to them or not. And I think this question of value is one of the, I'd love to talk about this more in the discussion. I think it is one of the real critical questions moving forward. How does journalism and journalists and news organizations, how do we get a better handle on the relative value, the value proposition of news? And so I think, what can AI do to help realize value in a more tangible way? And then finally, timeliness. And of course, we've already cited some examples of how AI can produce news at scale and with tremendous speed. And that's great. But could AI help in other ways too? Could it perhaps even lead to rethinking the temporal rhythms of news? So what I mean by this is that, we think of news by the breaking news alert. We think of it in terms of a daily product. We think of it in terms of, certain rhythms, daily, weekly, monthly, perhaps. Could AI help to lead toward new ways of thinking about the rhythm and flow of news from a time scale standpoint, to make perhaps the older things more relevant and to make newer things relevant for a longer period? I don't know, but the point being that I think there's much more to explore when it comes to how time might interact with new AI products and approaches. I finally want to end on this and I'll offer some concluding points. Recently, I edited a kind of a special forum of the journal Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly on artificial intelligence in journalism. And I would definitely recommend it. We had Meredith Broussard, Nicholas Diakopoulos, Andrea Guzman, who I mentioned earlier, and several other really great scholars who contributed pieces to this forum. But I was very struck by something that Meredith Broussard, who is the author of the book Artificial Intelligence, what she said in her piece. She said, when you find yourself making a prediction that a new technological tool will usher in a new era, she said, ask yourself, will it? Will it really? Hyperbole about technical tools is one aspect of a bias that I call techno-chauvinism, or the assumption that technical solutions are always superior to other solutions. And so even as we propose ways of thinking about the kind of one thing journalistic AI could do for democracy, I also want to temper that with the notion that I think in all of these conversations, it's worth really asking ourselves whether these are technical solutions for their own sake, whether they're actually necessary, and ultimately, what are they for in a much more normative and larger sense. So to wrap up here, the kind of question about journalism, what is it, who creates it, and so forth, what is involved, not just humans. This question, I think, remains a fascinating question, and it's a great entry point for understanding human-machine communication, which I believe is going to open up a number of interesting empirical as well as conceptual paths to explore. But that being said, we can do much more to explore normative theories for the study of journalism and technology, for developing concepts, for developing pedagogy in the way we teach, for rethinking practices. And I might say, of course, that this is evident in my own work. I mean, certainly I have not done enough to push forward these issues of normativity when I look back at things that I've written over the past decade. And it's something that I'd like to put more at the forefront of my future work. And so I believe that today's hyper-focus on AI provides an opportunity to kind of really bring this interest to focus on bringing normativity back into the conversation more fully. And let's also note that normativity is not exclusive to democracy. They're not just one and the same. I believe that it can extend to exploring what media and communication are actually for in a much larger sense. So I'm sure some of you are not studying news or journalism, but if you think about what you're studying, what are some of the normative stakes involved? And how is that thing actually oriented to contributing toward the good life, to the better life? So finally, I believe our challenge conceptually and empirically in terms of the theorizing we do, as well as the projects we engage, is to really envision not just what technology can do, the many things it can do can be great, but what technology should do for the good life in the much bigger way. And with that, thank you.